So, today, we're going to tackle a really powerful framework for understanding why Europe seems so fractured whenever an international crisis hits. It's a story of two totally different strategic mindsets, what the source material calls the shore and the citadel. Okay, let's dive in.
You've seen this happen time and time again, right? A war breaks out, and suddenly, European allies, who are all supposed to be on the same team, sound like they're living on different planets. Why? Well, the answer lies in two fundamentally different ways of seeing a crisis unfold.
And here it is, the whole idea in one slide. Think of it like two different operating systems running inside Europe. On one side, you've got Citadel Europe. It sees itself as a manager of order. Its whole logic is built around deterrence and handling these long-term threats, what's called the standing file. For the Citadel, the goal is to protect the overall strategic architecture. But then, you've got Shore Europe. It operates more like a coastline getting hit by a storm. It's not focused on the long-term file. It's focused on the opening act of the conflict, the ignition, and all the immediate consequences that come washing ashore.
So let's dig into that first operating system, shore logic. This isn't really about some grand long-term strategy. It's more of a mindset that just kicks in the second that force is used and starts moving through the system, kind of like a shockwave spreading out.
The way Shore Europe talks about a crisis is all about sequence. It's like a three-sentence story. The first sentence is always about ignition. Who threw the first punch? Who lit the fuse? From there, the story moves to exposure. Okay, who's going to have to live with the fallout? And finally, transmission. How exactly is that fallout going to spread? And you can see this logic play out in real time. When Spain refuses to let its bases be used for an attack, that's not just some political statement. It is a strategic move to avoid becoming part of the ignition itself. From a shore point of view, the moment you participate, you're plugging yourself into a chain of consequences that you have absolutely no control over. Norway's reaction here adds another critical layer. For the shore logic, the legality of that opening act is everything. Before you can even start talking about alliance management or strategy, you have to answer a simple question. Was that first move legal? Because if it wasn't, then every strategic argument you build on top of it is just sitting on a rotten foundation.
Turkey is a perfect example of how this isn't just about ideals, it's about pure geography. As a NATO country right on the edge of a very volatile region, Turkey's fear of destabilization and economic chaos isn't some abstract concept. It's a direct reflection of exposure. I mean, when you live next door to a fire, you think a lot more about how fast the flames can spread.
Italy's statement here really sharpens the point. Notice that specific phrase, initiated without warning. That taps into a core instinct of the SOAR. This feeling that a war isn't just a choice made by the country that starts it. It's a burden, and that burden gets immediately dumped onto all the neighboring and allied states. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. This isn't about Shore Europe being soft or just unwilling to use military force. Not at all. It's simply less willing to trust the promise that a limited strike is actually going to stay limited. It has a much stronger memory of how easily conflicts spiral out of their neat little boxes and turn into oil price shocks, refugee crises, or supply chain nightmares. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and see how this plays out at an institutional level, because this divide doesn't just exist between countries. It runs right down the middle of the EU's own official statements. Just take a look at this. This is a brilliant breakdown of an EU statement, and it's a perfect example of what the source calls a compressed institutional compromise. On the one hand, it condemns Iranian attacks and calls for restraint. That's pure Citadel logic, right? It's about upholding the strategic order. But then in the very same statement, it insists on international law and warns about supply chain disruptions. And that's the shore logic of ignition and consequence bleeding through. The statement doesn't solve the tension, it just contains both reflexes, mashed together. This brings us to a really key concept, the order of salience. The big disagreement inside Europe isn't really about being pro-this or anti-that. It's about what comes first in the story. What's the most important fact? What is the primary source of danger? That's where the two logics just completely diverge. But you know, this shoreline isn't just a metaphor for a diplomatic position. No, it's a physical, material reality. Let's take a look at how the consequences of a distant war become very concrete problems for Europe. And this is exactly how it works. A war in some distant region, well, it doesn't stay distant for long. It travels through these massive infrastructural networks, shipping routes, commodity flows, insurance rates, and it arrives as a problem on a factory floor in Germany or at a shipping port in Spain long before any of the grand strategic goals are met. The recent Red Sea crisis is a perfect stripped-down example of this.
The conflict doesn't arrive in Europe as a policy debate. It arrives as missing car parts. Houthi attacks force ships to go the long way around Africa. Critical components get delayed, and boom, major companies like Tesla and Volvo have to literally shut down their production lines. That's shore logic in its most raw, tangible form.
So this shoreline is really just a network of these incredibly vulnerable systems. It's the Strait of Hormuz, where Greek shipping companies worry about their sailors. It's a country like Cyprus suddenly having to become an emergency evacuation hub. It's the pressure on ports, on borders, on coast guards. This is where the disorder from outside actually makes landfall. All right, this brings us to what's probably the deepest layer of this whole divide. It's not just about economics or geography. It's a fundamental disagreement about the role of international law and, again, this sequence of events. See, for sure, Europe, the question of legality isn't some footnote you add at the end. It's an early warning device. Why? Because if a country is willing to cross a clear legal line at the very beginning of a conflict, it sends a powerful signal that it's probably going to underestimate all the other lines, political, material, you name it, that it's also about to cross. The legality and the consequences are tied together from the start. And that leads us to the one question that truly separates these two mindsets. When you look at a war, what do you see as the first disorder? What was the thing that actually broke the peace? And here are the two totally different answers. From the Citadel's point of view, the first disorder is the long-term, standing Iranian threat. For them, a specific strike isn't the start of the story. It's just one response in a story that's been going on for years. But for sure, Europe, the first disorder is the initiating strike itself, period. Because that is the specific physical act that kicks off the current sequence of violence. It's like they're narrating the same war, but they are starting on two completely different chapters. So let's just hammer this point home. The shore position is not pro-Iran, it's not anti-West, it is a structural perspective that simply puts things in a very specific order. Legality first, ignition first, and consequence first. It's an insistence that the very first act of a war has to answer to the law, no matter what the broader strategic context is. So, in the end, what you really have are two different, and in their own ways, equally valid forms of realism operating right next to each other. The Citadel's realism is all about the long-term management of strategic threats. The shore's realism is anchored in the physical, messy reality of how violence actually travels and spreads. Two different ways of seeing and feeling the very same conflict. And that leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? In a world where these crises just keep coming, which of these two operating systems is going to win out? Will Europe's future be defined by the Citadel's long-view management of order, or by the shore's much more immediate, unavoidable focus on consequence? It's a question that will absolutely shape the continent's future, something to keep an eye on.